Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Caleb with devslopes.com, and in this video we're going to talk about optionals. And optionals are an amazing part of the Swift programming language, and I want you to think about an optional sort of like a wrapper or like a box, okay? Now, it can hold something, right? Like a box can have something inside of it. A wrapper can have some type of maybe food or even like a drink, if you think of like a drink container. It can hold something, or it can be empty. Okay, that's what an optional is sort of like. It can have a value or it cannot have a value. Now, imagine you got a package delivered from Amazon. When you pick it up off your front porch, there can be something inside, but it's possible that at the fulfillment center there was a mishap and maybe your box is empty, which of course, that would be really disappointing and kind of a lame thing, but that is possible. The idea behind optionals is that we can safely use the box without having to worry what's inside, okay? That is the cool thing about optionals. So let's go ahead, let's pull open a brand new Xcode playground. So open up Xcode, and in this little Welcome to Xcode menu, click Get Started with a Playground. And we're going to do a blank playground. And I'm going to call this Shoes Optional. Just instead of clothing optional, just say shoes optional. A little more appropriate. Anyway, create it, and let's pull it open full size. There we go. By the way, if you're wondering how I'm doing that, I can make it take up the left side of the screen, the right side of the screen, anything like that. It's pretty neat. It's a little app called, what is it called? Magnet, right. It's called Magnet. There's another one called Flexiglass. I just happen to like Magnet a little bit better. Anyway, let's get started. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that variable there, and I'm going to get rid of that little commented line there. And I want to show you how optionals can work, and I'm going to use some images to represent them. So I'm going to create an optional image, and I'm going to create a non-optional image. So I'm going to show you how you declare a variable as optional. So go ahead and type let optional image, and we're going to make it of type UI image, but I'm going to declare it as optional by putting a question mark at the end of the type declaration. Now, of course, as it currently exists, it is optional. It can have a value, it cannot have a value, meaning it's able to be nil, or it's able to be, or to have a value. And I'm going to go ahead and give it a value just for the explanation purposes of this. And so I'm going to insert an image literal from the editor menu, and I'm going to drop in that image right there. Okay? Now, I'm going to add a viewer so we can see the image. Alrighty? And that's great. So there it is. This is an image representation of what an optional is like. It's a box, but it can be empty, meaning it can have a nil value. Now, let's go ahead and create let non-optional image, and we're going to make that of type UI image. Okay, and we're not going to put a question mark, meaning it has a literal value. We're going to go ahead and insert an image literal, and I'm going to use this image to represent that. And when I pull open this viewer, you can see what I mean. This non-optional image, well, it's an image, but it represents an optional with a value of 5. So this optional can have a value of 5, or it can have a value of nil. Okay, that's pretty cool. Now, I'm going to show you ways that you can actually use optionals, and then some things we need to be careful about, as well as at the end, I'm going to show you kind of a real-life example of using optionals. So we're going to go ahead and talk about forced unwrapping. So go ahead and type a variable here, var optional number, okay? And we're going to make it of type int, although we're going to make it optional. Okay, so this could be for something maybe that we don't know if it's going to have a value or not. Although, I'm going to set it to have a value of 5. Okay, so it's optional, but it has a value of 5. And I'll show you how this works in just a moment. Next, we're going to go ahead and just create another variable of type int and make it equal to 5 as well. Now, you'll notice the second one is not optional. So what I can do here is I can say if optional number is not equal to nil, okay, meaning if it is not nil, we're going to print, and we're going to put something in this print statement that says optional number has a value of, and we'll use string interpolation here to pull out the value of optional number, and we will go like that and pass it the value for optional number because we have given it a value, right? We say optional number has a value of optional number. Now you'll notice when it prints out, it says optional number has a value of optional 5. Now you're wondering, well, why is that? This is a way that Swift keeps us safe when we're programming. Since it is optional, it's passing in the value for 5, but it's keeping track that it's an optional value and that it could be nil. Now watch what happens if I change it to nil, meaning I give it a nil value, a value of nothing. You'll notice nothing happens because we're checking to see if optional number is nil. So let's turn it back to 5, but I said we're talking about force unwrapping. Now, this optional number variable has an optional value of 5, but in order to actually access the real value, we need to use an exclamation mark to force unwrap it. It's like we're opening the box and taking the value 5 out. We're actually getting it from the box. So that's force unwrapping, but watch what happens if I change this. Let's just say I take away this conditional check. This is to show you the danger of using an optional. Watch what happens if I change it to nil. Fatal error. Unexpectedly found nil while unwrapping an optional value. That's a problem. So this is where we need to be careful with force unwrapping. You need to basically set up conditional code to check to make sure that it's not nil. And you might be wondering, well, why would I ever have an optional value? Think about if you're pulling data from a server and you're not sure that a certain value will come back of a certain type every single time, it would be better to set it as nil, set it as an optional in case the value returns nil. So if that were to happen, you could say, if it's not nil, do something else, and then here you could basically set it up so that it would handle any errors, okay? That is just one way you could use optionals, okay? It gives us the option, right? That's the optional thing. It gives us the option of basically using a value or a non-value. So here we go. Let's go ahead and move on. That's force unwrapping. That's how you take an optional value and you force unwrap it into something that is an actual value. Pretty cool. Now I'm going to go ahead and just close these viewers here. They're giving us some trouble. And let's move on. So next up, we're going to go ahead and check out something called optional binding. Okay. Now, what we're going to do with optional binding is we're going to basically take an optional value and we're going to bind it to a non-optional constant. But the cool thing is that we will use an if-else statement to handle what happens if the optional number comes in as nil. So check it out. If we go ahead and type if let, and then we can say constant number. Okay, so we just created a constant called constant number. We're going to set it to be equal to optional number. All right, so now we have a constant that has a definite value of optional number. But what happens if constant number is not, what if we can't set the value of constant number? What if optional number is actually nil? That would cause a problem. So what we're going to do is we're going to print, let's print out what we see here. Constant number has a value of, and we'll print out constant number. Okay? Now, when this runs, you'll see that it actually does print, okay? We are creating a constant called constant number, and when it runs, let's run it, and you'll see it'll print out constant number has a value of constant number, but it's not doing anything. That's because our value is nil, and that's where our else block comes in when we're doing optional binding. We're basically binding an optional value to a constant, but we're using an if-else so that we can handle both cases, value or no value. So if we can create the constant and set it to be optional number, it'll print that out. Otherwise, we will print, what is it? Let's see, optional number is nil, because that's what it means. It must be nil if that's what is happening. And as you can see, optional number is nil, and so that is where we could handle errors, just like I said above. But the cool thing is that we can use constant number as a way of creating a non-optional value. Do you notice how we don't have to force unwrap this? Watch what happens when I set it to be a value of 5. Optional number and constant number has a value of 5. That basically allows us to create a non-optional constant from an optional. Pretty cool. So that is optional binding. You know what? Let me go ahead and put some notes here so we don't forget. This was force unwrapping. Force uncrapping. Whoops. Anyway, moving on. So let's go ahead and I want to show you another example. I'm going to create a function here called int printer. And it's basically just going to print out an integer value. Now, I can also use optional binding within a guard let. Check it out. Guard let constant number, just like above, and we're going to set it to be equal to optional number. If we can't do that, right, meaning if it's nil, we're just going to go ahead and say return, just like that. Now, assuming that we do get a value, we're going to go ahead and print constant number has a value, value of, what is it? Optional number or constant number? We'll just say constant number because it'll be the same as optional number. Cool, cool. So we've used the guard let to say if optional number has a value, set it to be equal to, or set constant number to be equal to optional number. Otherwise, return and get out of the function. So let's go ahead and let's call int printer. Whoops. There we go. And when it runs, you'll see that it prints it out right there a third time. But watch what happens if I set optional number to be equal to nil or have no value. It doesn't print. The only one that prints is our first one where we forced unwrap the value. Where we tried to bind it, but if we couldn't bind it, then we would print out optional number is nil. So change it back to have a value of 5. And we're going to move on now. We're going to talk about what are called implicitly unwrapped optionals. Okay? So an implicitly unwrapped optional is basically where we are going to force unwrap a value from the very beginning. So to do that, we can just say, I'm going to assume that a value is coming in as maybe 5. So let assumed value of type int equals 5. But if we're going to make this implicitly unwrapped, we're going to go ahead and put an exclamation mark. That means we are force unwrapping that value. So what we're going to do next is we can just say let implicit value of type int equals assumed value. Okay? So we are able to create a value. You can see over here that it does create a value of 5, but watch what happens if I make it nil. We get an error. Unexpectedly found nil while unwrapping an optional value. So unless you are 1,000,000% sure, do not implicitly unwrap optionals. This is kind of a last-ditch thing. It's kind of if you have to. If you're not 100% sure that there's a value, do not force unwrap or implicitly unwrap values like that. Okay, it's not good practice. Okay, so next up, there's kind of a really cool thing I want to show you with optionals called nil coalescing and something called using the ternary operator. So let's go ahead and call nil coalescing and using ternary operator. Okay, so we're going to create an optional integer. Okay, so go ahead and type let optional int of type int equals nil. And you'll see if we do this, it's going to not let us. It'll say we can't use nil on something of type int because nil is not an integer value. But if we set it to be an optional, that means that we basically put that in a box and we say, okay, the box can have a nil value or it can have a numerical value. So that's cool and all, but what if we want to create a variable, but we're not sure if optional int is going to have a value or not? Maybe we're pulling data from a server. So we can say let result equals, and watch what we can do. We can say it equals the optional int, but what if we're not sure? Now, if it comes back with a value, like if we gave it the value of 5, that's great, and now optional int is equal to 5, therefore result is equal to 5. But if it comes back nil, we might not want to set it to be nil, right? That would cause a crash in our application. So what we can do is we can use the ternary operator by doing 2 question marks. Then after that, we can type a 0. And what this is basically saying, and you'll see it as it prints out, is if we don't get a value, set it to 0. Otherwise, set it to be optional int. So this is kind of like else. Think of it like this. Optional int has a value. Let result equal optional int if there's a value. Otherwise, set it to be 0, meaning if nil comes through, it's going to set it to 0, just like you can see. Now, if I set it to 5, you'll see that the optional int will print out as 5 because it has a value. Really, really cool. So let's go ahead and set it to nil, just because it's pretty cool that it's using the ternary operator there. And last but not least, we're going to go ahead and use a real-world example with Comic-Con. I'm going to Comic-Con next month, and I'm really excited. So I was thinking about it and thought it was a perfect example for what we're going to do. So first of all, we need to create a class for Comic-Con attendee, and we need to create a class for their admission badge. So go ahead and type class Comic-Con attendee. Okay, and we need a variable. We need an admission badge, like so, of type admission badge, which that's a class we'll create in a second. But we're going to make it optional because everybody who goes to Comic-Con, they might not have a badge from the very beginning. They might want to buy tickets when they get there. So we need to create a quick initializer, and we're just going to say badge of type admission badge. And that, of course, is optional because they may or may not have a badge. And we'll just say self.admissionBadge is equal to badge. Just like that. Okay, so now we're going to create the admission badge class so that our attendees can actually attend. That would be helpful. So type class admission badge. And let's go ahead and just say for Comic-Con, we're just going to give a variable number of days. That's usually how Comic-Con tickets go. And every badge is going to have an explicit value, so we don't need to make it optional. And we just need to initialize it. So go ahead and type number of days of type int, and we'll set self.number of days to be equal to number of days. Very cool. So what we're going to do is we're going to create an admission badge. We're going to create a Comic-Con attendee, and we're going to give them that admission badge. So go ahead and type let admission badge equals admission badge, and we're going to pass in a number of days. Let's just give them a 3-day pass. And now we're going to create a Comic-Con attendee. So let attendee equals Comic-Con attendee, and we need to give them a badge. So go ahead and pass in the admission badge. And just like that, we have an admission badge and we have a Comic-Con attendee, which is really cool. But what if I was building an app where I wanted to show how many days left you have on your Comic-Con badge? I might type something like this. If let days attendable, meaning I have X amount of days left, we can check that by going into attendee.admission badge. And did you notice admission badge is optional? You can see that right there. And watch what happens when I type .number of days. That's because I might not have an admission badge. Okay, so it's putting an optional there so that it is safely unwrapping and safely using the value in my admission badge. So if days attendable is equal to number of days, which in this case is 3, we're going to go ahead and print, we're going to print this attendee can enter Comic-Con for, we're going to print the number of days here, days attendable, days. Else, we're going to print something else. Now, we need to think, what would we print if days attendable is not equal, or if days attendable number of days comes back as nil? We need to say this person has not yet purchased a ticket. Please refer them to the ticketing window. And watch what happens when we print this out. Okay, so it says this attendee can enter Comic-Con for 3 days. But watch what happens if I remove the admission badge. Remember, for a Comic-Con attendee, admission badge is optional, so I can pass in nil. What if I did not have an admission badge? If it comes in as nil, watch what happens. This person has not yet purchased a ticket. Please refer them to the ticketing window. Because I was using optional binding, and that basically created a constant here called days attendable. And I set it to be equal to the number of days from the admission badge. But if the admission badge is nil, then I get an optional value of nil, and it prints out here. This person has not yet purchased a ticket. This is called, let me put it up here at the very top, this is called optional chaining. And it allows us to chain values of optionals together so that we can get a value or handle errors when it returns nil. Optionals are incredibly helpful, and I really hope that you can see that. These are just some super helpful small examples of using optionals. And of course, if you're confused or if you want to know more, I would highly recommend digging into the Apple documentation. There are tons of examples there. So, amazing work with this video, and let's head over to the next one.